As a note, this is being recorded. But when I do the replay, I always make sure that it's my face on the screen. But welcome everyone for joining. I expect Rob to be along here momentarily just for replay purposes. I got my wires crossed this morning and sent him the wrong link. So we're getting that squared away. But I want to introduce a topic that I'm passionate about because it will make you such a better writer. And that topic is a read aloud session. Uh, this is I wish I knew who told me this, gave me this tip. But basically, years ago, someone said you should always read your stories aloud with someone because it just points out a myriad of issues. And what I didn't necessarily expect early on was that it would be absolute magic as well. But when I wrote my mother's book for the first time, so my first big project, we scheduled a read aloud session. It was my mom, my best friend, and I. We scheduled a weekend away. We went to Park City, rented a condo, and read. Oh, Rob has joined us. Yay. Thank you, Rob. And my apologies for the snafu there. So I've got you on. Hello.
Hello, hello.
And you're not on mute. So I was just explaining what a read aloud is, and how on my very first book, we went away, my mom, my best friend, and I, and we read her book, the manuscript, together over a couple of days. And it was a great girls' weekend. And it pointed out just a myriad of issues. Like when you're reading aloud, you notice, oh, that drags. You see typos you didn't see before. You
Right.
notice, oh my gosh, I'm falling asleep. This is my own story and I'm really bored right now. And it points out those things. It points out areas. I have a tendency to sometimes sound really pretentious in my writing. Don't use dollar words when dime words will do. Well, I like lots and lots of dollar words, and sometimes it just sounds ridiculous. And when it comes out of your mouth, you realize, oh, you sound so overblown right here. So anyway, I've been doing that now with every client, and I invited Rob. So without further ado, let me introduce our special guest this morning. Rob is the author of a #1 bestseller in no fewer than 13 categories. His book, Quirks of Light, his near-death experience, what I saw that opened my heart, has been resonating with people. The reviews just keep coming in. I don't know if there's a single review now that's less than 5 stars. I don't know. Last I checked, it was something like 40 reviews. It's really resonating with people. It's an important book. We poured our hearts into it. You worked your heart out for years on it.
Yeah.
Just did an incredible job. And without further ado, I want to introduce you and then talk about the read aloud session, because when Rob finished his manuscript, I invited him out to Utah. He's in North Carolina. I'm in Utah. We worked together for a couple of years, and finally you have this manuscript in hand. And he booked a flight, and we spent several days here together. And so I want to turn the floor over to you, Rob, and let you talk about what that was like for you. And then we'll have a little dialogue about it.
Sure. First of all, thank you for having me. I'm delighted to be here, talk about this, Rhonda, because it's been such a great experience. And, sitting down every morning and writing, and it was such a beautiful, part of my own self-discovery and working through these things, particularly a near-death experience, because there's no language for it. And you helped me so much with that. That was just an amazing journey that we had. But I have to tell you that the read aloud, what it did for me personally, and I'm so glad to hear you're doing that with all your clients, because honestly, I don't know too many coaches that actually do this, take the time to do this. But the importance of that read aloud was that for the first time, I actually was able to hear my own words, because you're buried in the manuscript, and you're buried in writing this thing chapter after chapter, and editing as you go along. But to hear it, and you and I took turns, and there were moments when we said, this really isn't working here. Maybe it's a little too syrupy or schmaltzy, or maybe we should use different language here. But you can't figure that out in your own head. Hearing it just brings a whole nother dimension to the project. It brings it to life. And that was the turning point in the project for me personally, because when we went through that process and, we cried together and laughed together and said, wow, this is really powerful. This works really great here, or take this out. It's a little too much. As you know, I had a tendency to use a little too much research. Sometimes it got too sciencey, or, I gave accolades to someone that was a little bit overblown and went on and on and on about that person. And when I did research, things like that. So to carve all that out and edit that down and focus on the story was so incredibly helpful. Plus, it was a magical experience, particularly working long distance. You and I, as you mentioned, worked long distance for a couple of years on the project, never got to see each other face to face, never did a Zoom meeting. They were all, just calls every other Sunday and working through edits together. So to be able to, sit down face to face in the same room and hear each other's voice and bring the project to life was incredible.
It was for me too, Rob. And I want to point out one moment, at least one. Do you remember while you were reading, looking over at me a couple times? And there are tears streaming down my face while you're reading.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. And same for me. And those were moments where, the magic and the muse and the spirit showed up, and we knew, wow, this is really powerful. We have to keep this. And there were times when, I took it to the publishing stage, and again, it went through a series of edits by someone that I don't know. You give it to someone else, put it in their hands, and sometimes they have their own ideas of why this does or doesn't work. And, you have to fight for that, because and that helped me fight for those moments that we both knew were right. We both knew those moments had to stay. And that's really important for authors to understand, because everybody goes through that process. And, you're just dealing with people, and they have their own perspective and own take on the work and on the project. And it's so important to know when to stick to your guns and when to relent and say, well, this person is experienced, they know a little bit more than me in this area, and when to just to give a little. But without that read aloud and knowing what those moments were, I don't know, I probably would have relented a little more easily, and probably would have taken the risk of cutting out some very powerful things that needed to stay in the book. So, yeah.
I'm so glad to hear you say that. Also, for me, it was a little gas in the tank for the next process that was to come. Because it was over a year ago that we did that session. That was February, right before the pandemic and right before all flights got canceled. But it was a publishing process that came next. And that's not the most fun part of the process, is it?
No, that's a painful process, because again, what I had to learn the hard way, as you can imagine, is that most of these publishers, they're presented with hundreds of projects. And, I was kind of taken aback when the publisher said up front, it was one of those soul crushing conversations that you had prepared me for along the way, that, guess what? I don't have the time to read your whole book. And it's like, what? You don't have the time to read my work? Well, why would you ever take on my project and think that you're going to edit it right? But the reality is that that's the business, and they don't read the whole book. We're going to skim through it, and to understand that up front, maybe then go back and say, wow, am I glad that we had this read aloud exercise, so we can, again, know which chapters and which things to stick with, and which were okay to cut out. But to think about someone not reading your work and just going through this process mechanically of editing was painful. It was difficult. And it was kind of like, okay, now it's time to grow up and understand that, this is how the process works. And so there was a lot of push and pull with this editor, my publisher's editor, and in the end, we came to an amenable agreement. But I would caution anyone that they have to know where to pick their battles and what to fight for, and when to listen to the so-called experts when it comes to editing. Yeah.
Mm, it's great advice. And also, I think it's okay to recognize when you know that it's good. There's this like wanting to detach from the ego and not being like, oh, I'm the most amazing writer. And we had many moments of self-doubt and wrangling and
Yeah.
just worrying about it. But there was a quiet feeling in that room while you were reading that it was good and that it was worthy and that it was important. And I feel like that understanding, that quiet recognition of, I'll call it the spirit whispering, this is important, prepared for the long year ahead.
Well, I think that for me personally, spirit is a big part of it. Because that's where, for me, that was my little prayer every morning before I sat down to write at 4:30 a.m. because I only had 3 hours before I went to work, to let those words come through me, not from me, which was very important. And I think that, as when I was done, because this was my first book, but when I was done with that process, and I have friends, and matter of fact, a relative that's quite a famous musician, and I have other friends that are in entertainment and things like that, and they all say the same thing, that like Paul Simon said, when he sits down to write, he sits down at the same time every day, and he waits for the show to start. So that that these words come through you, and some can call it muse, or some can call it spirit. And really, when those words come through you and not from you, those are the ones that have to stay.
Yeah. Well, I have learned a lot from you and how about that process, about humility and dedication. And just I'm so proud of you. First time author, you did it, and you're making a difference.
Thank you.
And so let's shift for a few minutes and talk about something else that's really important.
Yeah.
Because now that your book is out, it is resonating with people. And there's a thread in your book related to suicide.
Yeah.
And it touched you in two different ways, two important moments. Let's start by talking maybe about Frosty, the first experience with suicide in your book.
Sure, sure. And this is it's a tough one to talk about, because Frosty, not to give away a whole lot, because we certainly want the reader to enjoy the book and not be a spoiler, but Frosty was my brother-in-law who had taken his own life, unfortunately, 7 weeks before I died that night. And it's a sad tale, but a tale that we see so much now in society today, because Frosty had an anxiety problem, and he was going through a divorce, and he had his own business. He was on the cusp of losing his business. It was around Christmas time, trying to figure out how to pay for his daughter's college education, all of these things bearing down on him. And he had a bit of a history with drug abuse, but he was clean for 5 years, which is the travesty of the whole story. But as that pressure built and built and built that time of year, he decided to go out and blow off some steam. And unfortunately, he got a hold of a very nasty street drug that drove him mad for like 40 minutes, and came home and took his own life. So that was the first luminous soul in my story to lose their own life. And then after I got transplanted, I came to realize you have to wait a year, actually, after you're transplanted, to try to approach the donor family through the organ transplant organization. And I did that, and it took over a year and a half for them to respond. And finally, when they did, long and short of it is, I did end up meeting the family. But this person who I have living inside of me, I learned tragically had committed suicide as well. And that person took a different route. That person was young, and that person was bullied a lot online, and got into this whole social media deception of perfection and having to be perfect. And she was a little bit different in terms of, clothing she wore and things like that, but a beautiful, beautiful soul. Loved special needs children, was an artist, a natural born artist. I mean, just beautiful person. And she got all wrapped up in this, this social media deception because she felt unworthy. She came from a broken home, and one thing led to another. I'm not good enough. I'm not perfect enough. Started getting bullying. Then she started comparing herself to others online, trying to fit in, and went down this path that eventually drove her to taking her own life. And Rhonda, I have to share a quick story on this because recently it actually happened this weekend, which was so gratifying. One of my wife's a pharmacist, and she belongs to a network of doctors, integrative medicine doctors and things like this. And one of the doctors had purchased the book, and her and her husband are going through a divorce, but they have 3 beautiful children that are right in that very, malleable, vulnerable stage, junior high and high school. And of course, they're angry about the divorce, but they're turning to social media to try to escape some of this anger. And now they're becoming very robotic and losing kind of like their emotional intelligence and getting wrapped up in this whole world. And, curiously, the mother read the book and she was so moved by it that she bought a copy for each one of her children. And she said, I want each one of you to read this book, and you're not going to get your phones back until you do, because we're going to talk about this book and how it affected you, and kind of like a warning of, hey, this can happen to you too. So that was incredibly, incredibly gratifying for me to hear. And I'm hoping that, that message continues to get out there, because interestingly enough, because of these 2 beautiful people in the book taking their own lives, the book became a #1 bestseller in the category of the psychology of suicide, which was one of these unexpected gifts. And something like that, when something like that happens, it made the 3 years of writing the book all worthwhile. Yeah.
So your book is both, there's a message of hope for families who have been affected by suicide,
Yes.
and there's a warning for all of us. Talk about the hope side for a moment. When you met Frosty on the other side, and just what do you want to say about that?
Sure. And that's always love to end on hope and talk about hope, because I had before I died, I was raised Catholic, and I had a very I had a typical Catholic view of Jesus and religion and God and things like that. But what happened is that when I died that night and Frosty came to me, he said to me, I've made a big mess of things. I need you to go back and help clean things up. But tell my family I'm in a good place. And when he said, tell my family I'm in a good place, it really, when I came out of coma and I realized what happened, and it was verified that I had come off the gurney, like, a scene out of The Exorcist. I had sprung forward on the gurney, and I believe to this day that it was Frosty grabbing me by my lapels to get my attention, and he pulled me up off the gurney, and because I was unconscious, and my eyes popped open, and I shouted out his name, Frosty, and then I collapsed backward onto the gurney, and that's when code blue rang out, and I flatlined for 20 minutes. But it was when I came out of my coma that when my wife came to the bed, and I was talking to her like a child, and I said, you have to believe me, you have to believe me. Your brother came to me, he talked to me, he's okay, he told me he's in a good place. And she said, it makes sense now. And I said, why? And she told me what had happened right before I flatlined, and I was like, oh my goodness. So actually, and was curious that Frosty helped prepare the way for my second near-death experience, when my body gave out again in Chicago before my donor heart arrived. And I believe now that that was part of him coming to me as well, to kind of open my mind. But the story of hope there is pretty obvious. I mean, being raised Catholic, I was told that if you took your own life, regardless of the circumstances, it was no pass go. you're going directly to hell, and that was it, your soul's finished. But Frosty, having said, I'm in a good place, really changed that whole paradigm for me. And I began to wonder what other assumptions I had made about a loving God and our Creator, particularly when Frosty was not in his right mind, had taken drugs. And I came to understand that, those things are man-made assumptions. And that, again, opened the door for me to understand as I moved along through my journey, and all the other beautiful people from all different religious belief systems all over the world, everything from Sikhs to Muslims to Jews to Christians, were in my story and helped save my life. And all of the common threads that have woven through all of our belief systems, which is love. So that's the story of hope, that we're spiritual beings having a human experience. And who are we to know God's thoughts and to judge what acts God would consider to be, or determine whether our soul ends up in heaven or hell. Yeah.
Thank you for sharing today with our great readers and students here at Evalogue.Life, and for sharing you. I feel like thanking you every single time we talk, because I learn from you and it gives me perspective. I feel more grounded every time I talk to you, and I just hope your book continues to reach the people who need this message of both hope and concern for what we're experiencing in society today with anxiety and social media and drugs, these things that can very much affect our families and our children and grandchildren.
A lot of darkness out there, Rhonda, but it doesn't have to be. We're all made of light. We all our identity comes from God. And when we realize that, there's really nothing to be afraid of. So if we can keep ourselves connected to God's love and light and think about that. Myself, I start my day with a meditation and prayer routine, and that's my foundation, and that's how I start my day. And I would encourage, everyone to find their own way to connect to God's peace and love every morning before they get out in the world, because as you say, we need it right now more than ever. Yeah.
Well, thank you so much. Someone just posted the name of the book, please, and the author's last name. Let's end on that. Quarks of Light, Quarks, Quarks of Light. My guest today is Rob Gentile, Gentile. Please get his book. You won't be sorry. It's a bestseller for a reason. And another comment. Your book is so gripping and inspiring. I can't put it down. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much. You can also go to my website, because I have I try to get out there now regularly and post blogs and lots of other things that are going on, podcasts. So it's robagentile.com. And I'm so delighted to hear that you're enjoying the book and it can bring you some peace.
Thank you so much. So Quarks of Light by Rob Gentile. Go to his website, robagentile.com. And I think we're at 27 minutes. So
Okay.
we're good. Your time was, we're good on the time. So
Okay.
Thanks again.
Thank you.
Appreciate it.
Thank you, Rhonda, for having me. Good luck, everyone.
Okay. Bye-bye, everybody.
Bye-bye.